Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Real Farming Conference session against philanthropy, the role of foundations in colonizing the food system with Rupa, Marya, and Raj Patel, and myself, Anna LePay. I was just getting texts from friends that just tuned in to the former session and said it was amazing. So I hope you have been enjoying the conference if you've attended sessions before, or welcome if this is your first. I am talking to you from sunny and chilly Berkeley, California, unceded Ohlone land. And I cannot be more thrilled to be having this conversation today with my friends and colleagues, Rupa, Marya, and Raj Patel. For those of you who know them, you know that we are in for a wonderful, rich, and radical conversation. And for those of you who aren't familiar with their work, well, welcome, and you'll get a lot out of our time together, I'm sure. So in this session, I will say a few words of introduction about Rupa and Raj, and then I'll turn it over to them for a conversation about, if you've read the description of this session, about the history of philanthropy, philanthrocapitalism, and medicine, and together we'll dig into how we can challenge these forces that are impacting us in so many ways. We've reserved time at the end for your questions, and so you'll see in your Crowdcast screen a spot where you can ask questions. Please put your questions in there at any point, and toward the end of the session, we will get to those questions. And as a way of introduction, I thought it was perfect timing that as I was posting a tweet about this session this morning, just beneath mine on my Twitter feed was the announcement that Bill Gates has just joined a £3 billion bidding war to buy the world's largest private jet operator, just as he prepares to publish his new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. Investing in aviation might be not one of those ways we do that. So the irony of this, of course, I'm sure is not lost on any of you. And it's these kinds of ironies and these kinds of contradictions that are really at the core of why we so need to challenge philanthrocapitalism. As Raj and Rupa write in introduction to this session, as Rockefeller and oil were to the 20th century, Gates and big data are promising to be for the 21st. Yet in food and medicine, these technologies drive us away from the practices of healing and reparation that can restore humans' relationship with the web of life. This session will pull from ideas they've been developing in their forthcoming book, Inflamed, and together we'll explore how colonialism lives on through the activities and practices of the world's richest organizations and what we can do about it. So by way of introduction, we'll hear first from Raj. Raj Patel is a research professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, a professor in the university's Department of Nutrition, and a research associate at Rhodes University, South Africa. He's the author of Stuffed and Starved, the New York Times bestselling The Value of Nothing, and co-author of A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. And as someone who has devoured all 3 of those books, I can't recommend them highly enough. He's a James Beard Leadership Award winner, and he's completing a film on the global food system. And he's a leading thinker and organizer around the Green New Deal. He also serves on the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And in my favorite line of an old bio of his, he liked to say, he's worked for the World Bank and WTO and been tear gassed on 4 continents protesting them. Dr. Rupa Marya is a physician, activist, mother, and composer. She's an associate professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she practices and teaches internal medicine. She's a co-founder of the Do No Harm Coalition, a collective of health workers committed to addressing disease through structural change. At the invitation of the Lakota health leaders, she's currently helping to set up a health clinic and farm at Standing Rock. And she has toured 29 countries with her amazing band, Rupa and the April Fishes. And I will speak for all 3 of us in saying, as parents with children who are in various stages of coronavirus lockdown, hopefully none of us will be interrupted by our families during this session, but forgive us if we are. So I'm going to turn it over now to Raj and Rupa, who will be in conversation with each other. Raj will open with helping kind of frame the story of the history of philanthropy, and Rupa bringing us into a conversation of philanthropy and medicine and that intersection between medicine, food, and philanthropy. And then we'll go back to Raj and then to Rupa, and then we'll open it up again for questions. from all of you for conversation, and take a few minutes for wrapping up. So without further ado, again, thank you for tuning in, and I will turn it over to Raj.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thank y'all for being here. The y'all, I'm licensed to say because I am a Texan now, but part of that means I have to acknowledge the land that I'm on. And the land that I'm on here in Austin is only recently been called Austin, but it was the land of the Alabama Coushatta, the Caddo, the Carrizo, Come Crudo, the Coahuil Tecan, the Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo. And I want to acknowledge that because the process of having a conversation about philanthropy, food, and the history of the food system is obviously a story about colonialism. And you know, the University of Texas at Austin is starting to pry into its colonial past, and that's something that for a conversation at a conference that begins with the word Oxford ought to be of some interest. I know a lot of the universities here in America are looking into their colonial past, and Oxford kind of did that too a little bit. If you go, if you're in Oxford and you go down the high street, you'll see a college called Oriel College as part of the university. And you know, on the front of that college, you'll see a statue of a man called Cecil Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes, of course, you know, an important imperialist and colonialist. And you know, I mean, let me be fair. I mean, Oriel College did have a conversation about whether Cecil Rhodes should be held in effigy outside its college walls, and Oriel College said yes. And the reason that they were reluctant to pull down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, an odious man responsible for spearheading the colonization of large parts of southern Africa, and you know, had a country named Rhodesia. But the reason that Oriel College decided they didn't want to pull down the Rhodes statue is because they would lose £100 million in philanthropic donations. Now, the reason to talk about Rhodes in a discussion of philanthropy at the Oxford Real Farming Conference is, well, we've got the Oxford part, but Rhodes was a food system theorist. And you know, here's a line that he's supposed to have said, which runs like this. So he said, "I was in the East End of London yesterday and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread, bread. And on my way home, I pondered over the scene, and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. The empire, as I've always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists." End quote. So to pass this out, what Cecil Rhodes was saying was that capitalism had exploited the white working class, the proletariat of London, and he needed to fix that because he was worried that there would be insurrection. And in order to fix that crisis, what he needed was cheap bread. And in order to get cheap bread, you needed colonialism. You needed an empire that stretched across the planet. Now, with that in mind, the idea that you know, the complicated calculus of giving cheap bread to Britain involves taking things from other people brings us to the idea of philanthropy itself. In the book that Rupa and I are working on at the moment, Inflamed, we discussed this idea of how colonialism is a process of taking from one part of the world and transforming the relationships both there and the places where you know, the recipients of colonialism are meant to be. And I wonder if we can just sort of show what sort of exhibit A here. In our discussion of colonialism, we managed to dig up this. It's a game of European colonization in Africa. It was published in the journal Geography in 1974, and it's meant to be a teaching aid. It's played like Monopoly. And instead of chance and community chests, there are cards for fate and fortune. And if you land on fate, you could receive tribute from local chiefs, collect $10,000. Or if you land on fortune, you might have to pay each player $50,000 for wartime indemnities. Or your luck could turn and you could get a card that says, American philanthropists provide a new hospital, collect $150,000. And I think we can get rid of this game because it's odious enough as it is. But you get the point, right? That in the way that colonialism is represented, at least in '74, even then people understood that it was a sort of there were forces pushing back against colonialism, but philanthropy was one of the things that allowed colonialism to go. To sort of ooze its way forward. So philanthropy lubricated the wheels of colonialism. And the pitch here was that, yes, you were being colonized, but there's a class among the colonists of philanthropists who feel your pain and who understand that you might not be entirely happy with being colonized, but they're doing it for your own good, and they can offer a few crumbs from the table. Now, that idea that philanthropy is at some level a sort of a gentle kind of moral reparation for something that everyone sort of recognizes might not be 100% okay. That is a very 20th century idea. And we're sort of, if we're interested in the food system and philanthropy, we can see that at work, right? Through the 20th century, we had, for example, one of the biggest examples of philanthropy and the food system was the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, of course, was in macrocosm what it is that Rhodes was worried about. The Green Revolution was an attempt by the United States government, and mainly driven by philanthropists like the Rockefeller Foundation. It was an attempt to prevent communist insurrection from happening in a range of countries around the world. And the way you would do that is by providing cheap inputs, providing fertilizer subsidies, providing certain kinds of marketing subsidies and technologies that assembled themselves as the Green Revolution. And that philanthropy, again, driven by the oil money of the Rockefellers, was intended to make sure that cheap food was available in the cities so that you didn't have insurrection. In other words, the ideas that Rhodes pioneered became the sort of rallying cry of philanthropy, not because the poor were hungry. In fact, the poorest people were made even poorer by the Green Revolution. But the idea of the Green Revolution was that it was a stabilizing force. I mean, the reason the Green Revolution is called the Green Revolution is because it wasn't the Red Revolution like that of the Soviets, nor the White Revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. That's a verbatim quote from the US AID secretary who coined the term Green Revolution. He counterposes the Green Revolution against the Red Revolution of the Soviets. So again, philanthropy and state power were offered as ways of stopping certain kinds of people, the urban proletariat, from becoming communists and rising up, even if it meant other people had to suffer. And that's important if we're thinking about philanthropy and the food system right now. Because there's a sort of sea change in the way that the rich and the sort of plutocrats relate to hunger and poverty. And again, let's go back to India to sort of round this out. When Rhodes was saying we need imperialism, what he was doing was really mirroring the processes that were already happening in India. In order for the British to colonize India, they had to destroy the moral economy of feudalism that already existed there. Now, you have to celebrate feudalism to observe that in times of hunger and stress, it wasn't philanthropy that made sure that the poor didn't go hungry. There was just a social system in place that made sure that that feudal lords had a moral debt, an obligation in the moral economy to make sure that poor people had food. And that's why in the 2,000 years of recorded history before the British came, there was a famine once every 120 years. But after the British come, and after the British remove these moral constraints on the exploitation of the working class, of the peasants, all of a sudden you have a famine once every 4 years under British rule, in order that there can be an exploitation out of India and provide cheap food to those who need it elsewhere. And if you add that debt up, as Indian economist Utsa Patnaik has, the figure that the UK owes India for colonization is around $9 trillion. And so no matter what philanthropic crumbs are sprinkled back in India, the fact remains that the money was made through this process of extraction and exploitation. The same, the Rockefeller Foundation made its money through oil and through its its extraction, its massive climate debt, and through the sort of politics that prevented the rise of social movements demanding land reform. And we're moving now into a 21st century where even that residual kind of guilt of needing to make sure that the urban poor don't rise up, that's being erased. Philanthropy today is precisely filled with the kinds of irony that Anna just pointed out. In fact, today in my Twitter feed, it was observed that we now have a new world's richest man, Elon Musk. And he seems to care not one whit about anyone but himself, and in terms of how it is that he got to be where he is. He does have a foundation, interestingly enough. It has about $14 million that it gave out in gifts. 2 million to a foundation that's dedicated, to an institution that's looking into whether artificial intelligence is going to kill us all. So that seems to be his philanthropic interest. But he doesn't really care about his workers. He's anti-union, and when in support of the coup that the US masterminded in Bolivia, and when someone challenged him about that on Twitter, Elon Musk says, "We will coup whoever we want." Now, that kind of idea that the rich now no longer have a noblesse oblige, that there is no connection between, the demands of an insurrectionary poor and what the rich feel they need to do, that is a massive transformation from the 19th century to the 21st. And that means that the questions of justice and of our relationships to one another and our relationships to the web of life are not even part of the conversation anymore. And that's where I want to hand over to Rupa, because Rupa is right at the front lines of many of the massive contradictions that modern colonial capitalism has produced. And she can see ways to tell the story in ways that are going to blow your mind. So over to you, Rupa.
Thank you, Raj. Well, my name is Rupa Marya. I am the daughter of Punjabi immigrants, many of whom are farmers. And I just want to give a shout out to all the farmers in India who are currently rising up against global capitalism right now. Very inspiring. I'm talking to you today from unceded, occupied Ohlone territory in the territory of Huchin, what is now Oakland. And I work as a physician here in San Francisco in this just mind-blowing time of this pandemic, which has exposed so much about the architectures of our societies and those societies that have been constructed through colonialism. And maybe can you put up the slide? What Raj was talking about in terms of damaged relationships and the architecture of our societies being completely transformed through colonialism. This has led to catastrophic amounts of trauma for our ecosystems, for our social systems. And this trauma, what we show in the book that we're just finishing, leads to widespread inflammation in the bodies, in our societies, what we're seeing now in the United States, and all over the world on the planet. So you can put that down. So philanthropy actually shaped modern medicine in a really profound way here in the United States. And it was the same players who were acting on the farming, the food industry, who were also acting in the medical industry. And that was the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. So after the Rockefellers and Carnegies made their money through oil and steel, respectively, they turned their attention to the education system. And specifically, they commissioned a report by Abraham Flexner to look at the US medical system around the turn of the last century, and to make suggestions on how it could be educationally more beneficial. At that time, around in the late 1800s to early 1900s in the United States, most professors of medicine were people who had their practice and then they would teach medicine on the side. There were several different kinds of medicine practice. There was naturopathy, there was osteopathy, there was traditional Chinese medicine, there was all sorts of different kinds of medicine, a very eclectic culture of medicine at that time. But Flexner was obsessed with the German form of medicine that was developing at that time, which was very science-based. And the German form of education at that time really removed physicians from having to, professors from having to engage in clinical care, and allowed them to focus their time completely on being academic scientists. So it was a very science-first approach to medicine. So Flexner ended up evaluating all the existing medical colleges around that time and writing this report. And this report was damning to almost all the Black colleges in the United States, so most of them were forced into closure. It was damning to all the naturopathy and herbal medicine and what we call alternative practices, which were based on many traditional systems of medicine. And it really used the monies of the Rockefellers and Carnegies to then shape medical education. And it was going to be science-based. And instead of I guess at this time, medicine, instead of using, let's say, herbs or food as medicine, medicine became engineered. And a lot of those medicines that were engineered were coming from petrochemicals. So the antibiotics, the ointments, the vehicles for giving medicines. Even right now, the COVID vaccine that we are getting, the one from Pfizer and Moderna in the United States, has polyethylene glycol, which is a food-safe, non-toxic antifreeze, because it needs to, the mRNA has to be kept at such a low temperature. So these fossil fuel-based or petrochemical-based medicines have insinuated themselves into every aspect of modern medicine. And they've really shaped and, changed how we think about healing. And so, and what I found fascinating is that I am married to a farmer, and looking at his farming practices, a lot of those farming practices have also been based in a very similar idea. And this is coming from a traditional, agricultural science-based model of farming. And those systems actually, the way he describes it, is that you treat the soil as a substrate, and you kill everything around the soil that's living that could interfere, and then you plant your plants, and then you add the inputs as you think they're needed. And so it's a very chemically controlled, dominating view of the soil and of the food and of life. And it's almost a radical distrust in life. And I see a very similar thing to how we treat, let's say, cancer. So you just kill the cancer, and a lot of the chemotherapeutics that we use are medicines that were derived, again, from petrochemicals, medicines that were originally created as chemical weapons that have been, remixed and turned into chemotherapeutic agents. And so, for the bulk of the last century, the way we treated cancer was to just kill all the cancer cells. Now, what is emerging in to be probably the most exciting thing happening in cancer research is immunotherapy, where we're actually enhancing, drugs are being developed to enhance the body's ability to fight cancer through the immune system, which has its own abilities to detect, survey the body, and detect and eliminate cancer cells. But it's, this radical distrust in life, I think, has been a hallmark of both medicine and farming. And, I think it's part of why, as a practicing physician, I spent a lot of time learning about the Krebs cycle, and, how mitochondria, breaks down carbohydrates and releases energy. I have never used the Krebs cycle in my clinical practice. What I didn't learn in medicine was, that people are suffering from hunger in my own city of Oakland here, and how to address that hunger. What I didn't learn is how to get people safely housed in the midst of a pandemic. What I didn't learn is how to decarcerate our prisons so that, serving a prison sentence doesn't become a death sentence because of this pandemic. And so, I think the issue of hunger is a very important one, because it's this place where doctors are not trained to look at hunger or understand hunger, not only as a social phenomenon, but even a physical phenomenon. So maybe, Raj, you could talk a little bit about, what philanthropy does for hunger.
Thank you, Rupa. I think that it's important to understand how philanthropy shapes the asking of questions. There's a question from Stephen about, isn't philanthropy today really philanthropic capitalism, a way of creating larger markets for agricultural products? And you're right there, Stephen. I mean, I think that what the Gates Foundation is trying to do is provide infrastructure and support for the purchase of certain kinds of fertilizer inputs, chemistry, but the more important thing that they're doing is extinguishing alternative ways of thinking about solving the problem. And that, I think that's a really important part of how philanthropy operates. And as Rupa was saying, the way that Carnegie and Rockefeller drive what counts as legitimate medical knowledge and doesn't is happening in the food system. So let me do this by analogy with a group that's, in fact, was a vital part of the food system in Oakland, California, and that's the Black Panthers. Now, the Black Panthers had a way of addressing hunger that's very different from the standard philanthropic approach. The standard philanthropic approach is you give food because food cures hunger, and the Black Panthers understood that no, in fact, hunger doesn't get cured by food at all. Because hunger is the outcome of long histories of exploitation and poverty. And so you can't solve poverty with the giving of crumbs from the table. The way that the Black Panthers approached philanthropy was to see it as a part of the problem. And so instead, the Black Panthers' approach to hunger and fighting hunger was to do things like, yes, you give away free food, but you also give away free healthcare and housing and shoes and public security, education, the whole package. And it's not just that these are survival programs, but they were survival pending revolution. That's what the Black Panthers, these survival programs were always understood as, look, there is a dignified emergency among the poor right now. Yes, we have to meet it, but we have to address the root causes. And so that's what makes the approach of the Black Panthers addressing the systematic injustices and inequalities very different from the philanthropist who writes a check out to the local food bank. Now that, I think, gets us really into the heart of what it is that philanthropy can and can't do. What a Black Panthers approach to ending hunger involves is a radical transformation of the bases through which certain kinds of people are exploited in that other people get to be wealthy and then write checks and feel good about themselves at the gala. And that, I think, is the very big question here when it comes to understanding how philanthropy shapes knowledge. Like, for example, if we're thinking about the Gates Foundation and the way that the upcoming Food Systems Summit this year will be framed. On the one hand, you have billions of dollars being directed at the intensification of sophisticated, chemically driven agricultural technologies of the kind that Rupa was talking about. And on the other hand, you have a very poorly funded, but vast in terms of popular support, campaign for agroecology. The philanthropists have picked their winner, and it is based on the kinds of centralized knowledge, centralized technologies of power that got them their money in the first place. Gates gets a monopoly and then has the smartest people in the room to develop Microsoft, and that's the model he knows: smart people in the room solving problems. Whereas agroecology is precisely around a distributed form of knowledge and of mutual aid and of expanding the community from which one learns to the more than human community. And there is a difference there between the sort of humility before the rest of the natural world that comes from an agroecological approach and a humility that you can only have in a condition of equality. On the one hand, and then you've got your philanthropists on the other who are very happy to entrench the status quo and to keep inequality not just the way it is, but even more acute. So, I mean, I think that's the sort of message that we're landing on here is that what we're seeing in terms of philanthropy is not merely about creating markets; it's about entrenching certain kinds of relationships of power for the 21st century. And that's why I want to throw it back to Rupa to sort of really just land us where we are now, to talk about how the inequities that have that philanthropy has created and normalized are ones through which we are living in this moment around COVID and vaccines, and perhaps to share with us some ideas about what the future of food as medicine might look like.
Yeah, I think that COVID right now has really illuminated exposed the architecture of social violence of our societies structured through colonialism and through this mentality of maintaining centralized control and power. For example, with the COVID vaccines, if we really want to get ahead, there's two things. If we want to get ahead of the spread of this virus, all of the knowledge and technology and ability to develop and mass produce these vaccines should be open source, without patents, forever, without time limit. Because right now, those who have abandoned their patents, they're like, oh, during the pandemic, and then they get to decide, the corporations such as Moderna, when the pandemic is over, and they say, well, we think it's going to be over by July 2021. That's a public health decision. That's not the decision of a corporation. So to abandon all international patent law, to accelerate the knowledge and development of these vaccines, and to accelerate people being able to develop them in their own localities, so that we can get ahead of these mutating viruses as quickly as we can. Unfortunately, that's not the way we're going. And so we're seeing these variants pop up that are going to be, some of them are more infectious. And, you know, God forbid that now, once the spike protein changes, in a way that vaccines then become ineffective because we've gone too slow, because we've prioritized profit over saving people's lives again. And so, you know, while the vaccines will help us, and I think, you know, Dolly Parton did throw down $1 million, and I'll never talk bad about Dolly Parton because I love her. But, you know, we shouldn't have to rely upon philanthropists to do this work. And these vaccines, at least the Moderna and Pfizer, were funded by federal dollars. These are taxpayers' dollars. Over $1 billion, I think $2 billion in taxpayers' dollars went to the development of these vaccines. So these are things that should be owned by the public. The public should have a say in how they're distributed. They should not be guarded and kept the way that they are being right now. But ultimately, you know, will a vaccine save us from this pandemic? We don't know. And then the question is, what about, you know, the next pandemic that's coming? Because as the WHO says, this is not the big one. This is a warning. And I don't see that, you know, injecting ourselves necessarily with mRNA over and over again for each new pandemic that comes is the way to go. You know, if COVID is spreading in spaces of incarceration, which is what it is doing in our nursing homes, in our prisons, in our barrios, where socioeconomic structure of racism and classism that have been created through colonialism are creating these pressure cookers where the virus spreads, where land use has been allocated so that, you know, at least in the United States, you know, white people have access to great expanses of land, and brown and black and indigenous people are in these enclosures, whether they're in, you know, the urban city ghettos or in reservations. And so ultimately, if COVID thrives in spaces of incarceration, then the rule that to addressing these kinds of pandemic is going to be liberation of the people, of the animals. For example, the mink, the 17 million mink that were killed because they were mutating a virus inside themselves. So that the practices, agricultural practices that treat animals like commodities and not living creatures. This shows the thought pattern of violence of our agricultural society as well as our medical world. And so I feel like the vaccine, you know, if philanthropists are looking for ways to serve or to do something better, they should spend all their money, give it all away, and see themselves as a path to redistributing wealth and put it in the hands of those people who are actually doing the work on the ground. For example, like Tiny Garcia in Oakland with Poor Magazine, who's been building with poor people who are formerly unhoused, building their own houses. So people who are coming from spaces of deep struggle, who are buying back their land, indigenous people claiming back their land and reawakening relationships that have been systematically destroyed through colonial rule. So that is, I think, the only way to, I guess, get out of the moral conundrum of philanthropy is can you give it all away to people from whom it was stolen? And can those people be then liberated to create the solutions that only they will know how to create? This will not be solving climate change or solving the food crisis or our upcoming challenges I don't think will be things that will be solved from the top down. These will be things that will come from the genius of those people who have been resisting and thriving for over 500 centuries of colonial oppression.
Rupa and Raj, I think we're going to move to conversation now, and I'm getting a lot of really great questions in. Although Raj, did you want to jump in with anything before I ask some questions?
No, please. I think let's dive in.
Well, I feel like there's so many great questions that you all watching have added in, and I know that Rupa and Raj are getting lots of love in the chat, and I'm certainly feeling my appreciation for these two incredible thinkers and doers. And one of the questions that I had for both of you, that came up also as I was listening, and the three of us talked about this before, that I'm sitting in a position where part of what I do is actually philanthropy. I work for a family foundation and have a food sovereignty fund that I'm moving dollars through philanthropy and organize a lot within philanthropy. And so, one of the questions is, well, what positive role can philanthropy play? Or should we be kind of burning it all down? And related to that is, this question of, the origin story of philanthropy, which was historically a strategy to extract dollars from the public to essentially create tax diversions for the richest. And I remember seeing that Rutger Bregman video from Davos in 2019 that went viral. He's a historian who was on a panel at Davos with some of the richest people in the world. And he said, why you all are talking about all these wonderful things you're doing with your philanthropy, but shouldn't we really be talking about taxes? And I think his quote was, taxes, 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 all the rest is just bullshit. But just curious to have both of you dig a bit into, what positive role can philanthropy play, but also, how do we actually wrest some democracy out of a system that is inherently anti-democratic? And either one of you can jump in.
Raj, go for it.
Okay. Because I have taken philanthropy dollars and I've applied for and received philanthropic cash, and I'd like to think that part of that was to be able to repurpose some of the crumbs from the table from the rich. But I think that there's a socialist and an anarchist answer to this question, and both of them are good. The socialist answer is yes, taxes, taxes, taxes. Kate asks that government funding is limited and it's tied to certain things, and shouldn't we use philanthropy to try and do an end run around government? Well, ideally the government would be a democratic institution, but we know it's not. This is a government that's the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, and it's ridden with its racist and colonial legacies. And so there are places that its money will not go, and that means we have to fight to make the government democratic. And in the meantime, perhaps we can take the money from the foundations, which are trying to put themselves out of business, to be able to apply their money in a good way. But then there's the anarchist answer, which is, look, in the history of social movements, the revolution hasn't been funded. There has always been an undercommons, a way in which usually people of color are supporting one another through mutual aid. So the Black Panthers didn't write a grant to the Rockefeller Foundation, right? This was all about networks of mutual aid in which philanthropy was cut out precisely because philanthropy was part of the problem and wouldn't see them. And that idea of the undercommons, of the way that we conduct ourselves, that is not about the grant writing, but is about the mutualism of respect and love and sharing, That's actually much more seditious to capitalism than the grant writing that tries to put itself out of business, like the Atlantic Philanthropies did. And that, I think, the answer to the question about should we take the philanthropic money or not has to involve the short term. Yes, we're going to do an end run around the state, but the longer term idea is to do an end run around capitalism. And in that story, philanthropists can't play a role.
Great. Rupa, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that that's great. And I think that, I think that bringing this back to farming, when we think about that transformation away from a treacherous economic system, farmers are the holders of the seed, or ideally are the holders of the seed. Or if they're not right now, they really should start saving their own seeds, because they know that they can eat. So I did not marry wisely, economically speaking, but I married very wisely for times of great upheaval, because I married a man who saved seeds. And we are very, when every February, he lays them all out and we make a plan for what's going to happen with the planting. And that is wealth. You see the true wealth. And then the sharing of those seeds and the passing of those seeds without any money. And so I think that, yes, right now, as we're trying to feed people who are hungry in the context of this pandemic, we're starting a Farming is Medicine initiative here on the coast that, Anna, you are supporting, to reframe farmers as ecological stewards of the land and the water. We're working with our Ramaytush friends on land that is being rematriated to them in order to honor their ancestral responsibilities to take care of the land and the people in their territory, and to serve as allies in that work. And by reframing and recasting farmers as stewards and in their service of the earth, that food then becomes liberated. It's not about how much they produce or how much you can get, but that food is just grown and as a byproduct of their care. And then that food is taken to offer as care for people who are hungry. And so I think that, right now the vision is to help fund those with public dollars. But ultimately, can we create a society where that's just what we do, where our time and our life energy is honored, that is what we do?
Mm-hmm. Well, and this kind of goes into a question that we got from Jade, who asks, what about our own home scale philanthropy, where ordinary people give our money or time to helping organizations? And this kind of goes into some of the mutual aid questions that have come up. Your example about the Black Panthers, certainly, Rupa, I know from our conversation, some of what you've been seeing in the communities where you work and where you organize since the pandemic started, sort of some of that mutual aid organizing. So I'd love to have you guys talk about that. This question about, what's the sort of, what hand do we each have? Do we all have in this?
Well, I think the hand we all have is we have to get involved in dismantling this capitalist structure. That's like a first part, is that we have to all start. And by that, I mean creating alternatives that are exciting to people. And often those will be alternatives that involve radical new relationships. So for me, that looks like getting to hang out with someone who is formerly unhoused and becoming their very good friend and asking them, how can I help? And taking their directions. So whether that's, I need some cash for this, I need you to, get these people in to see a doctor, I need you to use your privilege in this way to help me tool the system. Then what's happening is the invisible networks that support my life of privilege as a physician are being hijacked by the undercommons to be used to advance their agendas. And so I think that learning to become very creative with encounters, allowing ourselves to be in spaces of encounters with people we might not normally intersect with, developing friendships, and then serving them. Don't lead them, don't lead a project, ask them, how can I serve? And then be of service.
Can I maybe just
go for it.
I mean, I agree. I think that there are.
You guys should write a book together. I feel like there's a lot of synergy I'm seeing.
But the idea of committing class suicide, I think, is tremendously. For us, and for most people who are in this sort of professional class we find ourselves in is an important part of the work ahead. But people are like, well, class suicide. Well, you're a communist. What are you advocating? And I think that the question about our daily philanthropy and mutual aid points to the fact that we already, in some ways, experience and live communism. I think this is one of David Graeber's observations that in our love for our children, for example, we don't write it off as a tax deduction. We don't ask them for a receipt. And we don't. I'm clearly missing a trick here. But the idea is that there are lots of relationships that we have that are about a love of people. This idea of philanthropy is precisely around the idea of caring and of love. And we engage in that without the apparatus of the idea of the tax write-off and of money being siphoned away from the public purse into the private purse, but instead understanding our relationships together as forging a kind of commons. And that idea of from each of us to each according to their need is what it's like to live in a world where we aren't sort of bound by these class, these anxieties of class and the stresses of class and the privileges and the ways in which we're interpolated to dominate through that class. So I think that there are ways that precisely the kinds of loving relationships that Rupa is talking about are the ways through which we can find that better world, and practicing more of them is vital to building the networks of care that we need in surviving late capitalism.
Mm-hmm. I want to pivot to a few questions that have come up, and I feel like it touches on a lot of what Rupa and Raj, your whole work, your life's work is about. This new book you wrote, you are finishing, Inflamed, is about, and much of what you both have talked about ties into, which is the way in which philanthropy, which is really an arm, a lot of philanthropy is an arm of essentially industrial power, of corporate power, how much that shapes narratives and how much that shapes people's sense of what's possible. Raj, you said just now, you had this line where you talked about how so much of this work is about extinguishing thinking about alternative ways to solve problems. And I was thinking, Rupa, about what you were saying about how some of the biggest philanthropists in the U.S. certainly have acquired much of their wealth from the oil industry. And then you tie that to looking at how, it's not a coincidence then around this connection between petrochemicals and medicine coming out of funding from those who gathered their wealth from from petroleum, right? And thinking about that parallel in food and ag, when the kinds of solutions you're talking about, Raj, that were pushed through philanthropists like Rockefeller and many other big philanthropists, again, gathering their wealth from oil. Again, what are those solutions? They're absolutely wholly dependent on oil, wholly dependent on fossil fuels and petrochemicals. And again, shaping what we think is possible in terms of medicine, what we think is possible in terms of food. So I'd love for you both to talk about that. There's a question from an anonymous person out there who asked, put it this way, does philanthropy not enable the donors to push their personal vision of the future, submerging any other forms of knowledge? So I just think there's a lot here to continue to kind of explore. I'd love for you each to dive in a bit.
Yeah, I think it becomes like a real expression of ego. And, I think what you're talking about is the limits of our imaginations that become circumscribed by either the goals of the philanthropist or the social system within which they have become successful and they feel is the way things should be because they're so successful. And so absolutely, I think that the only kind of philanthropy that would work, or not even would work, I guess, as a transition to completely redistributing wealth, is one of just giving that money to the undercommons, giving it away without control, ceding control. What was amazing to me when I was at Standing Rock doing the medical response with our Indigenous brothers and sisters out there was that you could walk around the camp at any time into like one of dozens of kitchens that were stocked by grandmothers who were just cooking food for everybody. And those were being, managed by philanthropists. They were not, there was no big funding stream coming in to fund up to 10, 12,000 people a day having 3 meals a day and no one going hungry. There was lots of mutual aid. There was lots of people, doing what they could. But I think that what is so threatening, I think, to the established order is a system where there are no enforced dependencies, where people can radically imagine a world where they have autonomy, and not in a right-wing libertarian mindset, but in terms of organizing their communities to be healthy and safe and thriving. And so, I absolutely think that, the money is usually given with that agenda attached to it.
And I mean, I think that's the sneaky word in philanthropy is given, isn't it? Because it suggests that there was private property that was legitimately acquired, and then it was transferred through the act of donation. And when you sneak in the idea that private property is legit and it's okay for people to give it away, you've done a great deal of ideological work. And it was, in fact, in the history of colonialism, there are lots of moments where, for example, the British go out of their way to smash institutions in which private property is not okay. Philanthropy is, the sort of guild on the idea of private property. It means that, yes, all right, private property might be a bit of theft, but it's okay because we understand that the poor got it tough as a result, and we'll give some back. We're always giving back, and it's never, the idea of taking is never really mentioned, and that's why we're very keen on the idea of reparation, and of the idea of sort of reparation ecology is that we understand how it is that this process of giving involves a process of taking, and that process of taking involves the idea of legitimating certain divisions between certain kinds of humans and other kinds of humans, or divisions between what counts as human and what counts as the rest of the natural world, and those kinds of divisions make it legitimate from one side to steal from the other, and then give away or give back. So I do think that in terms of the ideological work that philanthropy does, really that the sort of the big covering notion here is that not only that private property is okay, but there isn't any other way to give back. It's only by setting up a charity and then tearfully with tears, because you're just feeling so good. That's the poor, they love it so much when you give them stuff. That moment of sort of tearful conciliation is the only way in which property can legitimately be transferred, as opposed to the idea of reparation. And I think that's something that if we had a discussion instead about reparation instead of philanthropy, I think that would turn on its ear the idea about this legitimate private property circulating in the first place.
Right, which is why the Land Back is such an important movement here in Turtle Island and around the world, in terms of the primary step that has to be taken in order to have a just agriculture, a just relationship to food and farming. It must start with giving the land back. And so that is a very important part of the work that Raj and I are looking at and exploring.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I know we're coming close to the end of our time, and apologies for all of these great questions that we're not going to get answered here. But I want to throw out a couple, and then you guys can decide which one you want to dig into a bit more. One of the questions that came up was from John, who asked, philanthropy in the US is largely corporate-based. In the UK, it's also part of the social structure. Do you think the Prince of Wales support for environmental causes is a negative thing? For instance, without his intervention over 40 years, we'd be eating genetically modified foods and much less organic foods than we are today in the UK. So I think that that gets into this theme. One of the themes of this conversation is is there a positive role, and what could it be for those who are engaging in philanthropy? And then wanted to just raise up two more. One from Tom that asked if you each wanted to say a bit more about some of these new technologies that are being developed with the help of philanthropy, or as he put it, unaccountable elite funders, such as geoengineering or gene drive organisms, and to lift up that, for those of you listening, ETC Group has been doing a lot of work on this question. And then the final question that I think came up from a couple different folks is, again, around this question of wealth accumulation, extraction. But really going back to that Rucker Bregman quote, maybe around taxes, but what if philanthropists just never got that rich in the first place? I was telling Raj and Rupa, there was a news report about the hundreds of billionaires in the US who've seen their wealth exponentially grow during this pandemic. Michael Dell, the philanthropist alone, saw his wealth increase 70.7% since March of last year. So talk about wealth accumulation. So I don't think we're going to have time to get into all three of those questions, but just wanted to surface them for all of you listening to have a sense of what are some of the questions that the folks in this virtual room are asking themselves, and Raj and Rupa. And I'll turn it over to Rupa and Raj for some last words on those questions.
I'll jump in. I mean, yes, I agree. Who made these blokes as rich as they are? Now, if the Prince of Wales wants to opine about organic agriculture, I'm happy. But I'm not happy that there's a Prince of Wales in the first place. This is a guy who's sort of stolen half of Scotland and just got it. And then, decides to potter around in his garden and not use pesticides. That's great. There shouldn't be a royalty to start off with. I mean, and this idea of inheritance as a legitimate way of transferring private property is just as pernicious as philanthropy. And then, of course, these other technologies, particularly geoengineering, is incredibly dangerous precisely because it's so cheap. I don't doubt that at some point there will be a billionaire who takes it on himself, it'll be him, and will just decide to seed the air with silver nitrate or whatever it is, and will do it as a service to humanity. You're welcome. And it'll happen utterly unaccountably, because all of this has happened unaccountably. It's happened despite people protesting for the opposite. We'll see that at the Food Summit. We've seen it in the Green Revolution. And exactly, philanthropy is about the opposite of accountability. It's about wealth accumulation by a bunch of blokes who shouldn't have got that rich in the first place.
Hear, hear. Yes, I agree.
And Rupa, do you want to take on any of those other, any final words you'd like to say about this question of, where you see the potential for any structural interventions to disrupt that process of wealth accumulation?
Yeah, I think that if folks are listening who are philanthropists, I would say give your money to those folks who are doing work to dismantle the very reason why you accumulated that wealth. And there are several people and groups doing that work. It's just a matter of getting to know them and supporting them, and to support them with no holds barred, and just to give it all away. Ideally, we would be, in this society, as it is in these periods of transition, just taxing the hell out of everybody. Over a certain income, just taxing it at 100%, and giving that money back to the people to fund healthcare, to fund healthy food, to fund getting off of fossil fuels from every aspect of our society, and to create new technologies to keep us healthy.
Great. Well, here to that too, Rupa. And as always, it is such a pleasure to hear your incredible words of wisdom. I also recommend, I'm not going to put Rupa on the spot to sing to all of us, but she really is just absolutely, tears in my eyes, a gifted, beautiful singer. And I recommend you finding her music online, which is certainly doable, and listening to some of her songs. In fact, I recommend you do it right after this. You can Google Rupa's music. One of my favorite songs is Stolen Earth. Is that the name of it?
Stolen Land.
Stolen Land. So Google that and give yourself a treat. Listen to some of Rupa's beautiful singing. It's really moving. And then I also recommend doing what I did, which is pre-order a copy of this book that they're still finishing, but it's called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. It'll be published in August 2021. Again, it's called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice by Rupa and Raj. And you can pre-order it from the ORFC bookseller. You can find that on the ORFC website. I also love following these two on Twitter, which I know you'll see this. You'll see in the chat. And again, thank you all for joining us. Raj, Rupa, any final words?
Just thank you, and thank you for your work and for the spaces that you hold for everyone else. It's always an honor to talk to you.
And if there are any philanthropists out there who want to join me in being a philanthropy disruptor, please reach out. I feel like part of my role is to help organize philanthropy and direct philanthropy into the incredible kinds of work that Rupa and Raj are championing. So thank you again. And thank you to the Oxford Real Farming Conference for hosting these incredible conversations, and look forward to tuning into more sessions. I'll be doing one tomorrow and then a workshop on Tuesday. But thank you both, Rupa and Raj.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.